Coleman, and today I'm going to talk about the benefits of communication and organizational leadership. So as you can see, we're going to be talking about several topics in how to communicate most effectively. The importance of communication is it makes the world go round. There are 3 different channels I want to discuss today that a leader can use within their organization to effectively communicate. The 3 channels are verbal, written, and electronic forms of communication. Most of these we use on an everyday basis, from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep. Communication is very important. It generates ideas, it gets the ball rolling, and we couldn't get by from day to day without communicating our thoughts and ideas and feelings. So verbal communication is probably the most commonly used form of communication. It's also probably the easiest. It's done face-to-face, and according to Blair, it consists of talking and listening. You can't effectively have a conversation without somebody sending and somebody receiving the message. So a couple of things you want to keep in mind when verbally communicating with somebody or with many people is, who is your audience? You wouldn't talk to a group of corporate executives the same you would to a 4-year-old. So you want to keep your audience in mind and really try to project the message appropriately. Another thing is to consider the pros and cons of verbal communication. Sometimes a written form of communication will be better, but there are pros and cons. One of the pros of verbal communication is the reaction time is simultaneous. So you are able to see somebody's reaction immediately, and that immediate feedback is raw and honest according to understanding communication channels. But with seeing that immediate reaction, that could also be considered a con, because when you say something and the other person doesn't have time to respond, you're able to see their reaction, which may be a negative reaction. Or if somebody tells you something, you're not able to hide, or mask your feelings, if you didn't want the other person to know that you responded negatively. But being that you're verbally communicating, since it is the easiest, as in we do it without even thinking sometimes, if you see that the receiver is not understanding your message correctly, then you're able to respond to their reaction accordingly. So it's all done very quickly, and it can be managed easily. Another con to verbal communication is a lack of recollection, according to Adler and Elmhurst. And this simply means that when you're verbally communicating, sometimes you're not able to retain all of the details of the message. If there are a lot of details going on, or if there's a lot of emotions going back and forth, sometimes we may need time to process that, or we may need time to write down the notes so we'll remember later. So these are just a couple of things to remember when considering verbal communication. Another thing to remember is your body language. As you can see with this picture of President Bush, he obviously doesn't look interested in the conversation. Now, being that he, is the president in this picture, I'm sure there was something very important going on. But your body language is another part of verbal communication that is vital to conversation. It's speaking without actually ever saying anything. According to Horowitz, visual stimulation is very important. It drives us visually, and so when we see something, we're also able to react. Even though we didn't hear anything, it still sends messages to the brain that something's being communicated. So emotions can be seen instead of heard. Obviously, like his facial expressions, he looks bored, but his appearance is, he looks like he's dressed up for something important. So it's important for a leader to remember all the important aspects when communicating with somebody verbally. Am I dressed for the part? Am I paying attention? Am I making the right eye contact? Is my tone of voice appropriate? Again, comparing the 4-year-olds to the room of executives, you want your tone to be right because you wouldn't speak to them necessarily the same way to get a good message across. Another part, as I said earlier, is listening when you're verbally communicating with somebody. You don't want to just send out a message and then just leave it in the air. You also want to receive, feedback from the other person to make sure they're understanding what you're telling them. So instead of thinking of your next detail or your next question for them, really be in the conversation, and listen to the other person and what they're saying in the conversation as well. So according to McKay, listening must be productive. You must maintain eye contact when listening, and don't interrupt, sit still, nod your head, when needed or when necessary, and lean in towards the speaker. And this just goes to show that you're engaged in the conversation and that you care just as much as what they're saying as you do as what you're saying. So those are just important tips to remember when verbally communicating. But sometimes verbal communication isn't enough to get the point across, or maybe it's not the right channel to effectively communicate. And a leader needs to know when written communication would be better use of time. So written communication, some of the ideas to consider when writing, a message to somebody is there are different ways to do that. There's lots of different formats to written communication, as in business letters or business memos, or maybe it's just a letter to a friend. And so, of course, you would format those differently, but there's all kinds of different options available for written communication styles. Along with that same line, understanding communication channels says that written communication is important because it provides a record to be kept by the decoder. The decoder, or the person receiving the message, has the information written down and available to them, so they don't necessarily have to immediately remember it. They can look back if they need to and have a record kept of what was said. When writing a message, a leader should remember to be concrete, concise, complete, and correct in the details. And of course, with every letter, you're maybe not necessarily putting all the formal details in, but it's important to remember each of these small steps to really add to the most effective message. So here's some pros and cons of written communication. Some of the pros: records are kept permanently. They can be more effective when used right. As in the tone, even the tone in your letter is important to remember. And sometimes the message can make more impact if it's worded properly and in the right format. It's preferred for detailed messages. Like I said earlier, sometimes when you're having a conversation with lots of details, it's easy to forget. But if you write it down, you have that to look back on. And again, a leader can use that for his advantage as well as his corporation, because you have everything written down and you're able to review that later. Another thing with written communication is it gives more time for reaction or response. And these are important just to make sure that both parties are understanding the message and that it's accurately communicated. So some of the cons: it is a less personal form of communication, and it can be copied in the exact text, which really it could be a pro or con. If you don't want somebody to know what you said, don't write it down, because it can be copied and saved for later. But on the same token, if you do want somebody to remember what you said, write it down. So anyways, it's important for a leader to know when written communication is best. The last channel of communication that I want to discuss is electronic communication. And just within the last 20 years, this has become a widely used form of communication. It's literally in the palm of your hand, as in with your cell phone or maybe your computer or your desktop. Electronic communication can be anywhere we are. And this includes phone calls, voicemails, instant messages, text messages, and social media. All of these are part of electronic communication, and a leader can use these to deliver effective messages as well. It embodies verbal and written channels of communication. So some of the pros and cons of electronic communication. A pro would be many avenues are available. Like I said, your phone, your laptop, your desktop. There are many different ways we can communicate a message without actually being face-to-face with somebody. Probably one of the best things about electronic communications is how fast and how rapidly we can send out information. And not just to one individual, but we can send out one message, we can send it virally in just a matter of seconds. So, again, it can be written and saved, just like written documents, and you can reach many people in a short amount of time frame. Some of the cons for electronic mail, or for electronic communication, is that it's informal, it could be impersonal, according to Bleck. It's also non-traditional. You wouldn't necessarily write a formal text message to somebody. I probably wouldn't send a formal request to my boss through a text message. I'd rather shoot her a formal email or business memo. But the main thing to remember is it's 10 times easier to damage your reputation because of how easy, accessible electronic forms of communication are and how viral they can spread. It's important to remember that your message should be correct and accurate and also truthful, because it can go to many people in the blink of an eye. So it's important for a leader to remember the great uses of electronic mail, but also be aware of the negative part of it as well. And here's a couple of my works cited page for any references that may need to be further looked at for more information. But just remember, if you're a leader in the organizational company, that you should just remember, to be a good leader, you must have great communication skills. No matter what type of outlet you use, whether it be verbal, written, or electronic, you should be able to use all outlets to be able to produce the most effective messages to your employees, co-workers, and bosses, or whoever it may be. So, thank you.